to the Italian Football Podcast.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Italian Football Podcast. I'm Carlo Garganese. On today's show, we will be tackling a very big issue in football, especially for Italian football, and that is the explosion of ACL injuries. In recent years, Italian football and the Italy national team has been severely damaged by ACL tears and ruptures. It's something that we've spoken about a lot on the podcast. We've seen Federico, Chiesa, Nicola Zaniolo never realised their potential after ACL injuries. And we've had so many other Italy stars tear their ACL, including this year, Gianluca Scamacca, Giorgio Scalvini, and it's happening with more and more regularity, not just in Italy, but throughout the footballing world. And the last week alone, we have seen Juventus's Gleison Bremer, we've seen Torino's Duvan Zapata, and we've seen Real Madrid's Dani Carvajal suffer torn ACLs. And of course, there was a even more high-profile one with Rodri from Manchester City just a week or two ago as well. So ACL injuries, there's been many studies that have said that they've increased. I saw one study saying that they've increased 29-fold in the last 2 decades. So we want to find out what is causing this explosion of ACL injuries and what can be done about it. And to help answer this question, I'd like to welcome onto the show Dr Rajpal Brar, who is very prominent on social media and Twitter when it comes to sports and football injuries, and is one of the best sources on the subject of ACL injuries. He's a sports physiotherapist who works with many elite athletes based in the United States, doctor of physical therapy, a strength and conditioning specialist, a movement and mechanics coach, and a sports scientist, just to name a handful of his qualifications and skills. So Raj, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm doing well. I appreciate you taking the time to talk about, like you said, a topic that is becoming more and more prevalent, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately so. If we'll start off very simply first, if you could just tell us, like, what is an ACL and what is an ACL injury, just in layman's terms?
Yeah, sure. So, the ACL stands for your anterior cruciate ligament. People may often hear about, the cruciates. Essentially, it's a ligament in your knee that is a primary stabilizer for the knee, especially, again, so we call anterior translation, the knee moving forward, and then rotation as well. And so when you have a rupture or a tear, that ACL essentially fully tears, and which then, of course, limits the stability in the knee. A lot of it with ACLs, people will always ask me, can you walk off? Yes. The main issue comes is when you're cutting or moving in different directions. That's where it tends to be a major stabilizer. So that's really the issue when it comes to having an ACL injury or a rupture, is that your knee is now typically unstable when it comes to any non-straight line movements.
Yeah, for sure. Changing direction. So
Correct.
The recovery period for an ACL tear or rupture, what is the usual recovery period and the usual recovery process, I guess, in terms of surgery and recovery?
Yeah, honestly, it really varies. So the first thing to understand kind of with an ACL rupture is that what is the full extent of the damage? Not just obviously the ACL itself, but also oftentimes you can have associated meniscus damage, which is tissue in the knee. You can have other ligament damage as well. For example, you mentioned Dani Carvajal. I believe he has, I think if I remember correctly, he also has damage to another ligaments. So that can then extend the rehab timeline. Typically, with elite footballers, looking at around 7 to 9 months has kind of been the standard these days. And of course, there's going to be variance around that. But then the main thing I'm looking at really is return to pre-injury levels. And this is completely anecdotally, just from what I've seen. I will typically look around 18 months as a benchmark after surgery to see where the player is in terms of how they compare to pre-injury levels. So, and then you mentioned surgery. Typically for elite athletes, surgery is going to be the recommendation. There are now new techniques in terms of what you use to help replace that ACL. For example, like it used to be really a lot of hamstring grafts or patellar tendon grafts. Now there's also a quad graft that's coming in. You can use other parts of your anatomy to help reinforce the ACL as well, which we're seeing more and more. So there are techniques in terms of that. And then in terms of rehab, it's really first allowing that ACL to settle. But we're seeing more and more trying to get players back to weight bearing as fast as possible. And then it really just becomes more of a functional rehab where you're trying to maintain mobility, improve strength, and then gradually move that player from basic activities to more advanced activities that can be multi-directional, and then eventually sport-specific activities.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the time recovery period is definitely shortened over the years. I remember going back 30 years when it used to be 18 months sometimes, the recovery, just before you even get back to playing on the pitch. But obviously you're saying now 18 months to try and get back to the former level. So we'll come on to that again later, because that has been one of the problems with, especially with some of these Italian players,
Yep.
like Chiesa and Zaniolo, that they've never really got back to their former level. So I do want to tackle that again a little bit later on. But if we can look at what are the main in general,
Mm-hmm.
before we kind of dive a little bit deeper into some of the specifics, like what are the main causes and risk factors for ACL injuries?
Yeah, the first thing to really parse out here is we have contact ACL injuries and non-contact, right? Like, for example, I don't know if you saw Dani Carvajal's injury where he's kicking through and he hits the player's leg. And so, that's going to be a very different cause. If you get hit by enough force, typically it's going to break or tear something, right? So that is very different than, let's say, Bremer or Zapata, which are non-contact, or Chiesa or Zaniolo, or Rodri, which have been non-contact injuries, typically where the player has a spontaneous movement or a cut and that knee goes. In those cases, it's typically very multifactorial. I think the most we've seen recently, and we've talked about this, or a lot of people have talked about this now more so, is just the fatigue on players and the workload in their schedule, especially not having any off season. So we know kind of how fatigue can play a part leading to some of these ACL injuries. And then,
If
go
I
ahead,
could just
sorry.
stop, yeah, if I can just stop you on there, because that was going to be my next question. So I guess we
Mhm.
may as well expand on that now. How does fatigue impact ACL injuries? And like in playing more matches, doing more training, why does that make a footballer more likely to get an ACL injury? What does it do to the body?
Yeah, so we have to understand. So, an ACL, this is a little detailed. A ligament is what we call a passive stabilizer, meaning muscles are your active stabilizer. So when you're playing, right, you're cutting, you're moving, those muscles are actively contracting, right, to help stabilize your joints. Now, if those muscles can't do the job, now the stress goes to your secondary passive stabilizers, your ligaments. So what happens when you're fatigued
Mm,
is that those muscles may be unable to cope, right, because they're overworked. And now you have an undue amount of stress going into these knee ligaments. That's why the most, like for example, like with Rodri or a lot of these knee ligament injuries, these are movements the player have done thousands of times, right? So
mm.
it's like, okay, why on this specific one does that knee now go? It's for whatever reason is that during that movement, that stress now went to the ligament instead of going to where it should have, which is the muscles. And there's lots of underlying reasons for that. But oftentimes we find that fatigue can lead to that kind of that cascade.
Yeah, for sure, and that's something that Rodri spoke about. Ironically, before he done his injury, he said that
Yeah.
they were considering going on strike because there's too many games. So yeah, it played out true. Yeah. So sorry. Yeah. Before I butted in, like, so what other other than fatigue, what other causes and risk factors are there?
So fatigue is one. Another one is jumping too quickly in terms of like the intensity of competitions where you don't have a proper ramp up, So I think Roger, another example of this, I believe, like he only had a few bounce matches after coming back, and he went straight into a very highly competitive Arsenal match, right? And so that can play a factor as well, which we often see, just having that big jump in stress level on the body, which it's not accustomed to. That can certainly be one. Um, there's some credence to training techniques, but I can't really speak on that because it's so club and player specific, right? And so that's another factor.
With
Go
regarding
ahead.
to with regarding to training techniques, though, because
Yeah.
this is something that has been discussed in Italy. In Italy, especially pre-season, they
Hmm.
go berserk with what they call retiros. They're like training camps. They go into the mountains. They run,
Yeah.
run, 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 run. Especially certain coaches like Antonio Conte, for example, is
Hmm.
known as a drill sergeant. And they really do work them into the ground. Surely, if and that is generally the training, that kind of running, kind of physical training is more. They do more of that in Italy than in other countries. But that kind of training, would that make you more likely for ACLs because it adds to the kind of the pressure on the body, the fatigue. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it might just be a reason for overload, right? If you're not respecting where the body is, and again, we talked about ramping up too quickly can certainly lead to fatigue and overload, especially now that you have players who don't have a proper break over the summer, and they're already kind of burning the candle at both ends. You add that as another stimulus to a player who's already overworked, and then you
yeah,
add this boot camp, right? And it could be kind of the final straw that broke the camel's back. And so
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah,
So I'll give you an example from the Premier League, just because I'm the most familiar. Like it takes a lot if you really want to build true fitness. It takes years to do so. It's not just one camp that does it. For example, like when Mikel Arteta took over Arsenal, it took him. I remember this distinctly because I follow Arsenal. It took him 2 years until he said, I'm now happy with my team and their fitness levels. So it's not just something you can come in, have a boot camp, and now you're okay, right? It's really much more to do it safely and effectively. It requires a much more methodical process.
yeah, that completely makes sense. And in reference to your, you know, going from from straight up into from scratch to a high level intense game. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know whether I don't know whether you know, but it does seem like they're generally, especially in Italy, there always seems to be a lot more ACLs at the beginning of seasons or at the end of
Mm.
seasons. So I don't know whether that is partly the beginning is because, like you said, because for that reason, maybe the end of the season due to fatigue. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I,
we have
I would say the same thing. I'd say the start of the season, and this we tend to see that, but that tends to also reflect injuries, soft tissue injuries in general. Soft tissue being includes ligaments, but also muscles and also bone. Start of the season because you have players who are still adapting to that jump from preseason into normal season games,
mm,
and then end of season can be fatigue. And I think now the added variable, right, is you also have, let's say, for example, more Champions League games with higher profile teams playing each other earlier, which is
yeah.
already a jump in intensity quicker than you're used to. And so you have that aspect. And then we can even add in, like, if you're going back a couple years, right, you have the addition of the World Cup mid-season, which
Mm,
messes with everyone's training schedule. So you add all these in, right? So there's just
mm.
multiple factors. I think one thing I do want to touch on before anything else, we spoke on, Conte's training programs. I don't blame the coaches because you're all managers are now also held to a standard where they're not given time to succeed, right?
Mm,
So if I'm a manager coming in and I know my job might be on the line if I lose 5 matches, I don't have 2 years to have these players come up to the fitness levels that I want, right? So there's that mismatch between fitness expectation and the manager having a target on their back. So, right, there's that aspect too. That's a mismatch for sure as well.
everyone's under pressure for sure. And just
Yeah,
just before
exactly.
for everyone that's listening that are Antonio Conte fans, it will be screaming. I should actually stress though that I don't from as far as I know on the top of my head, Conte doesn't actually have a bad record with ACL
Yeah.
injury. So that might be a
Yep.
bad example to use. I'm just using him as an example because that is the kind of coach he is. But just also on the factors, and if there's any others you want to add after this, I wanted to ask you about, because this has been a debate as well. I know Steven Gerrard spoke about this a few years ago, about the debate on the increase in artificial and partly synthetic or what we call hybrid pitches, whether the
Yeah.
surfaces play a role in this increase in ACL injuries. Because when, again, going back 30 years when I started watching football, it was all grass, mainly all grass pitches. You'd have the odd artificial pitch.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it's all mainly kind of like hybrid pitches. And just thinking of it logically, because I played semi-professionally. And I was very injury prone myself as well. There's less give in the ground when you play on partly artificial grounds. Like, just thinking of things logically with no medical background, that to me that would seem as like more of a risk factor to. I mean, I don't know about ACLs, but certainly for injuries, because if you've got, that puts more pressure on you. But I don't know. I mean, I know we've spoken offline. There's nothing to really say to back this up. But could there be anything in this?
Yeah. I mean, it's so hard to say because there's so many times where the theory and it may or may not line up with reality. I mean, the research I've seen is that with hybrid grounds, there is an increase in foot and ankle injuries, but nothing has been shown for ankle injuries. The one thing, excuse me, not ankle, for knee injuries, the one piece of information I've seen on knee injuries actually is the drier the ground, the higher level there is for knee injuries because your foot is more likely to get stuck. Whereas when it's raining or slippery grounds, your foot will just slip, and which will take the torque off the knee. So that's the only research I've seen, but it also might require longer term research because these are relatively newer grounds, right, with the harder surfaces. And so I think it's still TBD, but as of right now, I haven't really seen that information. I also think there's a lot of selective attention because you'll see, this especially happens like in American sports, in the NFL, in football, American football, like a player gets injured on one of these new grounds and all the players complain. But when it happens on a grass field, no one says anything. So a lot of it can just be that selective attention aspect too, right? That's why research is so important.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So if we tackle specifically why there has been such an explosion in ACL tears in recent years, and I'll just read out a few figures so everybody understands kind of how bad it is. I saw on Twitter, and I'm sorry, I haven't put down who tweeted this, but there have been 38 cruciate ligament injuries in Europe's top 5 leagues in 2024 so far. Actually, that's 39 now because we're recording this on Monday. Duvan Zapata has been confirmed as an ACL tear as well. Right. So with 18 of those just happening just 2 months into the current season, Premier League 5 in total in 2024, 1 this season. La Liga 4 in total in 2024, 3 this season. Liga 11 total in 2024, 6 this season. Serie A is the leader with 13 total, 7 this season, and the Bundesliga 6 total in 2024, 1 this season. So it is. I mean, those are really bad figures. I mean, I've seen some studies that I saw one from a consultant orthopedic surgeon, Nev Davies, saying that ACL injuries have increased 29-fold compared to 2 decades ago. So I mean, the bottom line is that the numbers show that the numbers are increasing massively. So what is the reason for the explosion? I know we've gone through the risk factors there, but what would you say is? Do you think it is fatigue and the number of matches that are really, really driving this?
If I had to lay down on one thing, it would be that. It would be the scheduling. It would be the scheduling. And that's not just the reason I'm saying that is because it's not just football specific. If you look at other leagues where the games have gone up, you also see a jump in injuries. So, for example, I don't know if you follow basketball at all, but the NBA, after their 2020 season, where the season was delayed, they had their shortest offseason of all time, which is 45 days, which would be incredible for footballers. But in the NBA, you typically have 3+ months off. This was 45 days, and they had a huge increase in injury risk until they went back to the normal offseason again the following season, right? And in football, it's the opposite, where you have less and less of an off season to be able to recover. And if I had to pinpoint one thing, it really would be this fixture congestion, just because it's so critical to be able to have a break physically and mentally, especially from elite sport. That would honestly be the one thing I would point to the most. And that's why when footballers speak out about it, or coaches do, I want more to do so. So
Yeah. Yeah, I'll come on to that. I mean, it's incredible. And we've discussed this a lot on the pod that since the COVID pandemic in 2020, when that broke out, I mean, there's virtually not been there hasn't been any rest at all, because
yep.
there was the summer of 2020 football restarted again, and there was no summer break then because it was played during the summer, the
It's
Champions
mad.
League. The Champions
Mad.
League. Then in 2021, the Euros were played in the summer of 2021 because it'd been pushed back from 2020. Then in 2022, there was a very short summer break, much shorter summer break, because there was, like you said before, there was the mid-season World Cup in 2022. So there was no real between that summer and the summer after. That whole season was completely changed. And then, of course, there was the Euros in 2024. And then we've got this ridiculous Club World Cup in 2025. And then we've got the World Cup in 2026. So there's going to be between 2020 and 2026 inclusive. There's basically no rest at all. So
Yeah, it's mad.
So the big question is, what can be done to try and decrease the number of ACL injuries, this ACL epidemic, and what would you like the footballing decision makers and the football authorities to do? Because I mean, they have to do something about it, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's truly the big question. I mean, ideally, what I would love to see is some sort of 6 to 8 week minimum off season for players. I know it's tough to navigate with all the international games, but I think that would be the ideal. And it's twofold, not simply for the recovery of players, which obviously is crucial, but the off season is also typically a time where players build up their strength and fitness for the upcoming season as well. So, because you have the time and you're not constantly playing in games, you have the ability now to build up your baseline. So, as it stands, not only are players being asked to do more, but they're being asked to do it, with less, for lack of a better term. They're not even allowed to build up their fitness. So you have this complete mismatch where you can't recover, you can't build up your baseline, but yet you're asked to do more and more and more intensity games with more workload, et cetera, et cetera. So I really think you need that 6 to 8 week circuit breaker and then build up time, firstly. And then secondly, I feel like it'll never happen. I don't think this will ever happen, but some sort of cap on games over, per X amount of days or months would be great. But I think from a more pragmatic perspective, what you're seeing is clubs who are understanding how to rotate their players better, whether that's take them out earlier in matches or not allowing them to go to some of these, international games. And then also, last but not least, is also potentially building up their roster a little bit more so you can rotate more. But then the problem with that comes is the best players obviously want to play. So that's going to be now more on the manager to balance, right, some of those personalities. I think the biggest issue for me is that we know the underlying cause of why players are playing more, right? It's money. All these tournaments generate a lot of money. And when has UEFA or FIFA ever turned that down?
No.
So
More. It's always more. That
yeah,
Club World Cup is the best example of that, and an increased World Cup as well. That it's expanded, 48 team World Cup, so
yeah,
more games in the World Cup as well, more
yeah,
games in the Champions League as well. I mean, it's
exactly.
more. Yeah,
Yeah, and you're seeing. I think you saw at the Euros. You're seeing a watered down product because guys are tired,
oh, yeah.
right?
I
And just
don't know about
obviously
you, but I
injuries.
thought it was a poor quality Euros, with the exception
Yeah.
of Spain. I thought all of the big nations. I mean, Germany were okay, but apart from that, like the teams looked tired. They lacked intensity. It was just it wasn't good. It wasn't a good spectacle at all. It made,
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean that's part of it, and then that's if a player doesn't get injured, they're going to be gassed out, they're going to be fatigued, which of course impacts them. And then when they come back, it impacts them, of course, right? Like as we saw with multiple players who played deep into the Euros. So either you're not fit, you're going to be at increased injury risk, you're not going to be able to play in all the games. So there's a huge, massive knock-on effect. But I think the problem is those shiny, that shiny money is just too much for a lot of these, for UEFA and FIFA to turn down, especially since the decision makers aren't the ones at risk, right? It's the players.
No,
So
exactly, and that's
that
why.
is the issue.
I agree, and that's why I think that what Rodri said about players going on strike. That's why I think that they should consider that. I mean, otherwise,
Absolutely.
how are they going to get the message across and make and change? Because you try and sell to somebody, oh well, you're going to play less games, but you're going to make less money. It never happened. Doesn't matter about
Right.
safety. We see that everywhere in any business around the world. So yeah, I do think something needs to be done because football is really ruining football, and that brings me on to the final question, is because the ACL injury has become the dreaded injury in football. Again, 30 years ago, it used to be a broken leg. A broken leg used to be the injury that everybody, any footballer or sportsman used to fear. I don't want to break my leg. That's
Yeah.
going to. Now it's ACLs. Now it's like a broken leg is like no one's worried about breaking. Hardly anyone breaks their leg in football now anymore either.
Right.
But no one's worried about broken legs anymore. Now it's all about the ACL. So why isn't the ACL such a dreaded injury? And why do so many players like Zaniolo and Chiesa, who, were for many generational Italian talents, but have never been, since they come back, have been shadows of their former selves? Why do so many players find it so difficult to return from ACLs as the same player?
Yeah, I think it's multiple things, as it usually is. I think the first part here is because the ACL, the game has become so dynamic and multi-directional, right? The speed has never been higher. Change of direction has never been higher. Some of the demands on players just on the pitch have never been higher. So now with the ACL, like we talked about at the start of the podcast, right? It's one of the main stabilizers for multi-directional knee stability. And so there's a bigger demand on it all the time. So I think that's one part of it. I think, secondly, with that, and we see more research on this, is the confidence factor in your knee, especially after a non-contact injury. So let's say, like I said, you played with injuries. Let's say you were out there playing and you just made a cut you've made thousands of times before, and you did your ACL, even though you know the underlying factors, right? Let's say this person's very, very in tune with all the things we've talked about, and they understand it was probably fatigue, it wasn't their own fault. But in the back of your head, you're still thinking, I just did a normal cut, right? And I did my ACL, and I've been out for ideally whatever 6-8 months. So that's going to be in the back of your head. There's a term for it called kinesiophobia, fear of movement or re-injury. That's one of the hardest things to get over when it comes to ACL injuries, and you can only get over it. There's much better sports psychology programs now. Like every team has a sports psychologist for the most part, but the only way to get through that is to go through these matches again. Like you have to get out there and play, but that still comes with that trepidation factor. And that's why that 18-month mark for me, it's a key reason for it. It's why it's so extended. I think that's another part of it. And thirdly, and this especially applies to Serie A, you've seen guys come back very, very fast from ACL ruptures. Zaniolo came back from his first one
Way
in
too
six,
fast. Way too fast.
yeah, 6 months. I think Chiesa, they took their time with him. Thankfully, also obviously he hasn't been himself.
Mm.
So before I forget, that's one other aspect is the pressure component when you get back for a player right, is that fans right away are like, oh, we want to see the player who's back.
And
I think
you're
the
more
play,
at risk as well for another
yeah,
ACL, aren't you? After
yeah,
doing it, and you often overcompensate onto your other leg, and that's what happened with Zaniolo, isn't it?
yeah,
He did the ACL in his other knee
other
after
knee,
coming back. Yeah,
very quickly after coming back. I think
yeah.
I looked at some research today where it's like most players, if they do have a follow up ACL injury, you are increased risk on that knee and the other, more so on the reconstructed side. But even then, within the first 2 months is the highest risk of re-injury. There's good research showing that for players under 25 years old, if you come back before 9 months, your ACL re-injury risk goes up, I want to say like 6x, something like that.
Wow, that's
Something like
insane.
that. Yeah, but the same. So like, but here's the thing with elite football, elite sport, you're paid to play,
Hmm.
and they're going to get you back a lot of times, as soon as they can. So, there's that aspect as well. And I think a lot of that has to do with some of the differences. I don't know if the differences within teams or, some of the cultures of football, right? That
Hmm.
could be there as well. So that's not things I can speak on directly, but that always plays an influence too. So those are factors that certainly play a role as
Yeah,
well.
Zaniolo was mistreated. I said it at the time. He was brought back too fast. He started playing regularly, too much, from the start, and playing too many
Yeah,
games. And he was called up to the Italy national team like a few weeks after coming back from an ACL injury. I remember
yeah,
Mancini
mad,
calling him up, and
mad.
it was just madness, absolute
Here,
madness. But yeah, just finally, just to spin off this about coming back from injuries. Do you think it's easier for players that play in defence to come back to their previous levels from ACLs rather than, let's say, attacking players or wingers
yeah,
like a Zaniolo Chiesa, because it's not so much about the movement, changing direction, the use of speed, the acceleration. Is that something you would agree with?
yeah. I would say in general. So positionally, players positions that require less of that stop start multi-directional constant is going to be easier. And then just in general, players who use less of that, because obviously whether it's a winger or it's a midfielder, certain players rely more on that than others. So I'd say generally as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's leave it at that. Thank you so much, Raj, for coming on. That was absolutely brilliant. So much insight and expertise, and I think everybody will really appreciate everything that you've explained in this pod. So thank you so much. Before we let you go, I'm gonna share where everyone can find you. So on Twitter, you can find Raj at the handle at 3CB performance. I would definitely say follow Raj. He's one of the best follows if you want to know about, certainly about injuries, and he also knows his stuff about football as well. Should also subscribe to him on his YouTube page. Again, 3CB Performance. We'll put a link on in our intro for that. Which has lots of great videos, but again with injuries, lots of great stuff about injuries, recoveries, and explainers, and kind of what we've done in this pod today on various injuries and on individuals that have got injuries and their recovery times and everything. And also check out his website www.3cbperformance.com. Is there anything else before we let you go? Anything else you would like to share? Anything coming up? The floor's yours.
No, I mean, only thing I have a weekly newsletter. It's on Substack called 3CB Quick Hits. I typically just review, one research article per week, typically on whether it's sports injuries or sports performance or whatever it is. It's free. Just trying to do it, so people are. I try to just synthesize research for the layman and just translate it for them, what it means, what takeaways they can use, and stuff like that.
Fantastic, yeah. So definitely do check that out. So yeah, thank you so much, Raj. I hope we don't speak to you again. I hope that there's
Me
no more
either,
injuries, but I'm sure there will be, especially in Italian
unfortunately.
football. Well, I wish you all the best. I know you've got to get to work now because it's early where you are in LA. So have a great day and everything. And yeah, everybody else that's listening, thank you for listening. We will be back later in the week at some point. So until next time. Ciao, ciao.